Hi, welcome to Crash. Hi, welcome back to part 2 of Crash Course Knockoff, I guess. To begin this episode, presidential candidate Richard Nixon is currently the star of our show. With him, he's brought a new political awakening. Previously, from about World War II till now, the parties were very similar. But now the elections of the 1960s are pushing the Republican Party to be redefined into suburban conservatives. They're generally against the civil rights movement, expansive government, any intrusion into states' rights, and the Vietnam War. The main faces of this conservative party shift include William F. Buckley and Barry Goldwater. Goldwater was a Republican senator that led this conservative shift and spoke for the white middle class, concerning himself with the issues of the New Deal, civil rights, and communism. Nixon entered the stage in 1968 with a campaign centered around Goldwater's ideas. Cunning and eager to win the presidency above anything else, his campaign was used to impress the newly minted Republicans, but his actual actions in office strayed far from his conservative promises. Domestically, Nixon strengthened environmental protection through a new and shiny Environmental Protection Agency, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, Endangered Species Act, and Clean Air and Clean Water Acts. He also supported arts and culture through increasing the federal art endowment budget to $60 million. Nixon actually worked together with Democrats in Congress to increase funds for Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, as well as renewing equality acts like the Voting Rights Act and Title IX, later the Civil Rights Act.
Overall, Nixon tripled federal spending and was up to the billions. His initial supporters with Goldwater beliefs were really pissed with him and his liberal activities. Nixon appeased them by kissing up to the Southerners and slowing his desegregation policies.
He was determined to be reelected and held a freeze list and enemies list of the people he thought were threatening his chances. Internationally, Nixon initially trashed the Paris peace talks and started to bomb North Vietnamese supply routes in Cambodia. This accomplished absolutely nothing except upsetting the Cambodian Khmer Rouge, which was a really, really bad idea. The Khmer Rouge ended up killing a quarter of its population after overthrowing its government, targeting anyone who seemed American, Vietnamese, or educated. Meanwhile, Nixon implemented a new policy of Vietnamization to replace American soldiers with Vietnamese troops and instead supply Vietnam with money and resources. Both American and Vietnamese soldiers were unenthusiastic and eager to leave their posts. At home, anti-war protests were common and often had minor casualties, like at Ohio's Kent State University and Jackson State in Mississippi. It seemed as though no one could escape the horrors of the Vietnam War. Finally, after his re-election, Nixon called for a ceasefire in 1973 and withdrew American troops from the country. Nixon's foreign policy also expanded the new relations with communist countries. He made a surprise visit to China in 1972, signifying a drastic change from the actions of previous presidents. The US and China were now on friendly grounds after decades of tension and disagreements. Nixon also made new deals with the Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev concerning Cuba, agreeing to end embargoes and construction from both sides respectively. In 1972, he went to Moscow to make the Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty, or SALT I, and the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, or ABM. These treaties limited the world's supply of nuclear weapons and aimed to create peace between the two countries. Lastly, Nixon supported Saudi Arabia and Iran, as well as Pakistan, which discouraged relations with India. He created a new economic policy that got rid of the notion that the US dollar was the standardized exchange rate worldwide. Nixon's hope was to free other currencies and make it easier for foreigners to buy US goods, boosting the economy before his next run for office. Many political and cultural movements defined the will of the people during Nixon's presidency. The women's movement was one major movement that made huge changes for the roles of women in society. Women were still considered to be much lesser than men, even in the 60s, and were unhappy with their lives and limited careers. Women began to run for office in larger numbers and were elected to positions like those in Congress and in state legislatures. They began to lash out at society's expectations in various ways, including the mockery of the Miss USA pageant with Robin Morgan, the filing of lawsuits against university hiring practices, the establishment of the feminist press, the honoring of Harriet Tubman, and the launching of Miss Magazine with Gloria Steinem. Roe v. Wade was a major achievement for women in 1972 when the Supreme Court ruled that women had the right to choose to have an abortion. The National Organization for Women, or NOW, lobbied for an equal rights amendment in 1970, but were unsuccessful in the ratification of the amendment by the states. Hispanics also fought for their rights, especially those involved in field labor. Notable figures included Cesar Chavez in Delano and Dolores Huerta, who founded the United Farm Workers Union. The union bargained for better salaries and working conditions for the farmers. The two also teamed with Filipino leader Larry Itlong in 1965 to go on a grape picking strike in Delano, California. Their strike was successful and received widespread support. Native Americans also pushed for equality by taking over Alcatraz in 1969. The American Indian Movement, or AIM, was also formed and became the most widely recognized Native American organization during the 1970s. AIM led a takeover of Wounded Knee in 1973, and a government agreement to reconsider the treaty rights was won. Due to their efforts, the 1972 Indian Education Act also provided funds for new schools that would be under tribal control, and Indian tribes began to be recognized by the government as legitimate agents. The civil rights movement was by far the most defining movement of this age, and it was starting to move north in the 1970s. Boston's school segregation was smacked down by the government, and New York held a citywide teacher strike against racial integration. Even more white middle class moved away from the city and into the suburbs, and as a result, more African Americans had the chance to be elected mayor. The Supreme Court's Bakke decision narrowly decided that race-based affirmative action for university applicants was unconstitutional. The court also ruled in Lau v. Nichols that school districts must make accommodation for students who could not speak native English. Gay liberation also became a political movement in the 1970s after a raid on the Greenwich Village. The gay community was tired of hiding their identities and were no longer willing to submit to arrest and held the Stonewall Rebellion as a response to the raid. New changes began to appear, and openly gay politicians such as Elaine Nobel and Alan Speer were elected to state legislature without major backlash. That same decade, the American Psychological Association removed homosexuality from their list of psychiatric disorders. Life during the 70s changed dramatically and was defined by sex, drugs, and rock and roll, known as the counterculture. Massive festivals like the Woodstock Music and Art Fair boasted more than 400,000 attendees and was basically America's first Coachella. The music was played by popular artists such as Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin. In San Francisco, the Summer of Love event brought over 100,000 hippies to the Haight-Ashbury district to celebrate weed and making love instead of war. Unfortunately, all the love led to disease and overdosing, and the counterculture phenomenon couldn't last long. The Republican Party was a major opponent of these groups fighting for equality. Among them was specifically Phyllis Schlafly, who credited herself with ruining the Equal Rights Amendment Act by giving speeches on how American women already had it better than everyone else. She had a deep hatred for feminism, abortion rights, homosexual rights, and believed in prayer during school. Pat Robertson founded the Christian Broadcasting Network and urged the Catholics and Protestants to come together and have enough Republican votes to run the country. Jerry Falwell founded the Moral Majority, their motto being pro-life, pro-family, pro-morality, and pro-American. Falwell considered himself to be more right-leaning than even Goldberg. The Moral Majority registered over 2 million new Republican voters before the 1980 presidential election. While the 50s and 60s featured economic prosperity, the 70s did not. Unemployment and inflation combined to create stagflation, and Americans began to discuss the misery index. Nixon had done little to reduce government debt and spending, and economic stimuli did nothing but make inflation worse. The misery index was the combined harm done by the unemployment rate and the inflation. Problems got worse when the rapid rise in energy costs occurred due to Arab retaliation and raising oil prices. Problems got worse when a rapid rise in energy costs occurred due to the Arab retaliation and raising oil prices after the U.S. supported Israel in the Yom Kippur War. Disposable income declined as oil and gas expenses shot up. As the Rust Belt, or unemployment in Northeast and Midwest, declined, the Sun Belt, or the changed and New South, rose and gained economic importance. The government had little control over the economic issues, which greatly angered Americans from both parties. Nixon's presidency began a slow decline after he was reelected in 1972. The crisis known as Watergate both defined and ended his second term as president. It all started with an illegal break-in in the summer of 1972, where plumbers, as a part of the Committee to Re-elect the President, or CREEP, broke into the offices of the Democratic committee chair in Watergate to put a tap on his telephone. They were given permission to do this by President Nixon's advisors. The plumbers were caught and arrested, but Nixon decided to dismiss the issue and ordered the CIA to stop the FBI investigation of the burglary. The issue was well hidden until the burglars were put on trial and convicted. One of them, James McCord, revealed his secrets to federal prosecutors, which started a chain reaction of many resignations from Nixon's advisory committee. The Senate Select Committee began to investigate further and found out about Nixon's taped White House conversations, which would prove that he was aware of the break-ins. Nixon was demanded by both the public and the Supreme Court to turn over these tapes, but refused and cited executive privilege as his excuse. As a response, representatives in the House began to vote on his impeachment. Rather than face a trial he knew he would lose, Nixon resigned from the position of presidency on August 9, 1974. The new president and former vice president, Gerald R. Ford, was suddenly now left to clean up all of Nixon's mess. He was really trying his best, and people liked him, other than that he was considered to be a little slow after playing football too often in college. His top goal was to heal an annoyed and tired nation, both internationally and domestically. Ford gave a full pardon to Nixon and introduced a controversial proposal for draft evaders, giving them an option for alternative service as a way to heal the internal tensions from the Vietnam War. Ford wanted to counter the economic stagflation by fixing government spending and reducing the federal deficit, but Congress insisted on large tax cuts. Most of his presidency would be spent arguing with Congress over which way would be more beneficial, and as a result, the economy barely recovered during his term. Internationally, Ford had issues with Russia and Vietnam. The Cold War's issues were still evident, and Ford tried calming relations with the USSR by signing the Helsinki Accords to promote scientific cooperation. In Vietnam, the U.S. troops were long gone, but advisors, the CIA, and State Department officers remained in control over the Vietnamese soldiers. Congress was on their last straw with the war and would not allow Ford to send emergency military aid to the country. In April of 1975, after Laos and Cambodia had fallen to the Khmer Rouge, South Vietnam surrendered and North Vietnamese tanks took over the country. The remaining American officers and personnel abandoned the U.S. Embassy, and the Vietnam War was finally over. Jimmy Carter won the next election in 1976 after promises of a better performance than Ford, specifically with plans to actually deal with the misery index, unemployment, and feelings about Watergate. However, Carter's presidency didn't really do much to fix these issues. OPEC increased the price of oil by 60%, and Carter's stimulus checks and energy plans were only creating a spiral of inflation. Carter's foreign policy was at best mildly successful. His best triumph was the Camp David Accords, a successful attempt to make peace and land trades between Egypt and Israel in the Middle East. However, his SALT II agreement with the Soviet Union quickly fell through when the USSR invaded Afghanistan and violated the American containment policy. Carter made gain trade embargoes and in order to boycott the 1980 Summer Olympics in retaliation, but his actions hurt his popularity. The worst foreign policy disaster was with Iran and the Iranian hostage crisis. After allowing the overthrown Shah of the previous government to hide in America, the new Iranian government attacked the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and took 66 Americans hostage. In response, Carter froze Iranian assets, expanded pressure, and tried an attack on Iran to get them released, all of which also failed. The hostages were not set free until Reagan was elected in 1980. Reagan pulled an easy victory over Carter due to his many failures in both domestic and foreign policy and his lack of effort in campaigning for re-election. Now we enter the Reagan Revolution of 1980. Reagan would bring in an era of conservatism that the nation hadn't seen for decades. His supporters shared beliefs of strong anti-communism, anti-crime, and anti-tax. Many were social conservatives, which were very religious and had strong opinions on rights for gays and women. Reagan had three main goals for his presidency: increasing military spending to beat the Soviet Union, cutting domestic spending and government-sponsored social programs, and cutting the federal income tax. Reagan's economic policy, known as Reaganomics, consisted of supply-side economics. This tactic would stimulate the economy by supporting the supply side rather than federal spending, and cut taxes by up to 30% to support investment and, in turn, create new jobs. He was successful with this, and domestic spending was reduced significantly. Reagan also made a quick example of what he would do with organized unions when he fired 11,000 protesters at Patco. The economy began to pick up after a slow start in 1982, which delighted Reagan and his supporters as his new economic policies had finally changed the nation. While not all of the demands of his conservative followers were met, like anti-abortion regimens and school prayer, they still supported him in the election of 1984. The economy continued to rise, and Reagan's tough stance against the Soviet Union pleased voters. And Reagan's sunny disposition and campaign motto of "Morning Again in America" carried him to a steady victory over the Democratic candidate Walter Mondale. Reagan was shot while leaving a speaking event in 1981, but recovered and used his skills as an actor to reassure the public. In Reagan's second term, he continued to cut taxes, but shifted his focus to foreign policy issues. His firm belief in anti-communism led him to portray the USSR and all communist countries as the evil empire. He continued with his massive military spending and arranged for missiles to be put in Europe, all while refusing to speak with Soviet leaders. Reagan also created a new and shiny strategic offense initiative in 1983, also known as Star Wars. You can't make that up. Which was about an effective and realistic as it sounds. It was projected to use space stations armed with lasers to prevent Soviet missiles from reaching the United States, but was never officially launched. It definitely did its part to scare the Soviets, however, along with the increase in size of the U.S. military. In the Middle East, Reagan extended his foreign policy to manage the issues with Carter's Camp David Accords. He believed that U.S. policy was tilted too much toward Egypt. They aimed to create a buffer zone to neutralize the Soviet-friendly Iraq and Syria. In Afghanistan, the U.S. supported rebels who fought against the Soviet rule, and in Libya, Reagan dealt with leader Muammar Gaddafi and his terrorist attempts by bombing their headquarters. When Iran and Iraq went to war, America remained mostly neutral, but members of Reagan's national security aimed to support Iranian moderates by supplying them with weapons. In Latin America, the United States supported U.S.-friendly dictatorships, and communist-influenced insurgents rose to power. Yet Congress passed the Boland Agreement to prohibit the U.S. from seeking to overthrow the communist government in Nicaragua. To secretly bypass this obstruction, Reagan aides used the money made from sales of those secret arms to Iran and diverted it to anti-communist, or Contras, in Nicaragua. The secret wasn't kept for long because after an American cargo plane with military supplies for Contras was shot down in Nicaragua, the Sandinista government let the whole world know of the aid the U.S. was providing. Now, talks of a second Watergate were flooding the country, but the last piece of the puzzle was how much the president knew about the Iran-Contra deal, or if he knew anything at all. It was clear that Reagan knew what was going on, but it could not be proved, and although talks of impeachment ended, Reagan's approval rates plummeted. However, he pulled it together at the end of his last term when he started talking about finally ending the Cold War. The new leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, had new policies of glasnost and perestroika to fix the Soviet economy and political system and to be more open with the new ideas and relations. Reagan agreed to work with Gorbachev and established the INF Treaty to end intermediate-range nuclear forces. The two countries also began to work together to end the conflicts in Nicaragua and Afghanistan and build friendly relations between their citizens. In essence, the Cold War was over, and Reagan and Gorbachev were bros. In the next election of 1988, Reagan's Vice President George H.W. Bush took the presidency over Michael Dukakis. Due to Reaganomics, the economy had changed drastically from how it had been before his term. Stock values played a major role in the ascent of many billionaires in the 80s, and the Black Monday scare of 1987 terrified investors. Fortunately, another Great Depression did not follow. Many savings and loans businesses became a victim to this plunge and either closed or had to be bailed out by the government. The changes in the rest of the country were mainly in the fields of music and technology. The We Are the World single and the Live Aid concerts featuring popular artists like Bob Dylan and Michael Jackson raised money for the famine relief in Africa. American rock artists had come to dominate the world, and their fame was made possible by the new music technology and fast distribution of tapes and CDs. TV stations like MTV broadcasted their songs to the young generations of America all over the country. And the 80s also featured numerous movies that packed theaters, such as the Star Wars trilogy, Raiders of the Lost Ark, and E.T., which inspired a really great Katy Perry song. They could also be watched at home through new technology like the VCR. To many staunch conservatives, the entertainment industry of the 80s was completely immoral and against the church. Why wouldn't it be? The opponents created the religious right and a Christian coalition, teaming up with the Republican Party in attempts to end the sex, crime, and abortion they felt was fostered by the new cultural changes. The immigration law of 1965 made a huge impact decades later as immigrants took advantage of the family reunion clause to enter the United States, many of which came from different places than during previous eras. Most of the immigrants made their way to California, Texas, Florida, New Jersey, Illinois, and New York. Reagan's amnesty law allowed many to stay, while debates about immigration became more heated. There were also changes for Native Americans, as the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act and federal court cases made it possible for natives to operate gambling casinos on their reservations, leading to prosperity for many tribes. The AIDS epidemic was the last defining factor of the 1980s. Since the CDC had reported AIDS in 1981, the conservatism of the Reagan administration had influenced its decision to routinely deny their requests for research funding. It was later found that the agent of the disease was HIV. It was thought that it was a disease exclusive to gay men and intravenous drug users, but it was quickly proved that the disease did not discriminate. The early 1990s featured more funding towards AIDS research, and soon it ceased to be the ultimate death sentence that had been in the early 80s.